Redefining Normal, a virtual symposium for navigating the new normal in the classroom. My name is Margaret Judson, and I'm the City Director of School Connect. The mission of School Connect is to facilitate dynamic partnerships with public schools and the community surrounding them. Today's symposium is an example of how community partnerships work, with each bringing their assets into today's conversation. I know this is an especially busy season for you and appreciate your taking the time to be with us. Today's conversation is geared directly toward you, the educator. We have gathered a distinguished group of community mental health experts and public school counselors who will share with you their thoughts on how to practically equip both you and your students for the upcoming school year. I'd like to introduce our first speakers, Tali Dolge, CEO, Jewish Family Services, and Christy Dean, Chief Clinical Officer. JFS has been providing affordable mental health counseling, group therapy, and senior services to the greater San Antonio community and beyond since 1973. Tali and Christy will help us to understand how to deal with anxiety and stress during this time. Tali and Christy?
Hi, thank you all so much for joining us today. We could not be more excited to be a part of this incredible panel of distinguished people to talk about anxiety during a pandemic. Christy and I have actually been doing this conversation since March about anxiety during a pandemic, and we've been talking about this not only to individuals, but we've been talking to big groups, and we've also been talking to corporations and associations all over Texas. So right now, Christy is going to tell you a little bit about herself. I, again, am Tali Dolge. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Jewish Family Service. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and why I chose to speak about anxiety in the face of a pandemic.
Thank you. I'm Christy Dean. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer of Jewish Family Service. I'm also a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist and a board-approved supervisor for both of those licenses in the state of Texas. I've been working in the nonprofit industry and in the mental health community of San Antonio for 25 years, and it is an honor to join you today to speak about this topic.
Thank you, Christy. So I can only hope that what all of you take from this talk today is a message of hope and optimism. I want to begin with my lifelong relationship with anxiety and why I have spent my life working in the mental health field and advocating to change the stigma associated with mental health care. In March, as the United States was preparing for a shutdown and the grocery stores were running out of hand sanitizer and toilet paper, I was preparing for my old constant companion to return with a vengeance. That old friend was a big, huge dose of anxiety and panic, something I had dealt with during my entire life. We were told in the coming days that we would all no longer be able to leave the house for an indefinite amount of time. Things began to shut down and life as we knew it would never be the same. During this time, I heard from friends, family members, colleagues, and my staff about the fears that they were experiencing. Most had fears and anxiety around either they or a loved one would become ill. Others were afraid of losing their job or financial hardships. Let's be honest, many of my friends with children were terrified to be home all day long with their children. I know you get the idea. So while all of us were preparing for our new normal, I found myself in a very familiar scenario, social isolation. And I was okay. I wasn't mad. To give you a little history, I was a highly anxious child. Then I became an even more highly anxious teenager. I don't mean just the normal run-of-the-mill anxiety. Let me give you some examples. So I would have heart palpitation and sweats just getting into the car or going into a grocery store or sitting in a movie or even just having a conversation. I was always convinced that I was dying of a number of different diseases. I was so afraid of death that I would actually stay in bed all day just to see if it would happen. I would end up overanalyzing any conversation in my head and was able to give myself a full-blown panic attack at the outcome of a situation that never came to be. These are just a few of the daily thoughts that continued with me through my formative years. This made it difficult for me to stay in school, have meaningful friendships, and go about life in a way I saw my friends and family doing. I was so envious and wished I could, quote, unquote, be normal. In my senior year of high school, it got to the point that I refused to go to school because the panic attacks became so bad. This led me to not being able to leave my house for 6 months in my senior year of high school. I was missing school at a rate that if it continued, I might not graduate. I spent those 6 months not being able to leave the house with the exception of going to a doctor's appointment or therapy. During that time, it was excruciating, lonely, depressing, and extremely scary. But it was also a time of growth, resilience, determination, and finding pieces of myself that I never knew were there. These pieces would prepare me for a life that I could have never imagined. So to say that I was prepared for what we're experiencing now is, well, an understatement. And the familiarity is overwhelming. Some of the lessons that I had taken with me from my high school years were simple, yet profound, and here are just a few. That I was so much stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. People who are in uncomfortable situations grow and learn in a more profound way. I learned through the practice of cognitive behavior therapy how to retrain my thoughts. I learned that fear is irrational and can come and go at any time, but it will not kill me no matter how bad it felt. Pushing yourself to go outside your comfort zone, even in really small steps, makes the biggest, most impactful life changes. Read inspirational books, read self-help books, but really just read for fun during this time. Make a routine for yourself, no matter how difficult it could be, especially when it feels like we are all reliving the same day over and over again. Know that this too shall pass, but always bring the lessons learned with you forward. My panic and anxiety and the time I spent in my house have been the things that make me who I am today and led me to the job I do. I will say without a shadow of a doubt, I would not change anything. These are some of the lessons that continue to motivate me and help me to strive for more every day. So this brings me back to today and where each and every one of us are. This, I pray, will not be another 6 months that we're not able to do the things we used to do or leave the house, but I know that it's going to be a little while longer. The things that cause me the most anxiety is the unknown of everything in this world, and that I don't have control over this situation. Something I am taking the time to really explore and understand about myself. But this just brings me back to the lessons that I learned so many years ago, and I actually smile. I smile at how far I've come. I smile at the fact that I can now help someone else with their fears and anxiety. I smile that we all get a moment to reset and think about how we can come out of this better and stronger. I also smile at the fact that many will now understand that this anxiety and panic that we are all feeling will not kill us, but will make us much stronger and more resilient. Thank you so much for listening to my part of the story. This next part, Christy will discuss the differences between stress and anxiety.
Okay, everybody, I'm back. Thanks, Tally, for your story every time. It's just very powerful to listen to. We're going to do a little overview about stress versus anxiety, kind of what the differences are. And most of you may be familiar with this, but it's an important refresher in order to understand what's going on with all of us right now. So the biggest difference, I think, is to look at how stress or fear is a response to some kind of threat, some kind of external threat. And if you think about the saber-toothed tiger being a threat to the caveman that we descended from, there was that adrenaline rush that was life-saving. We needed that response, that stress reaction in order to survive. Today's threats are a lot different. Most of the time, they're an argument with your spouse, or a deadline, or a boss that fussed at you. And all of those things, the physical response may not be as helpful. And we've all learned to kind of try to monitor our physical reactions to stress and look at those differences and try to resolve the physical reaction that we're having. When you think about anxiety, anxiety is that response to stress, but it keeps happening even when the threat is no longer there. The threat keeps playing in our minds. And so it becomes this continuous presence of the perception of a threat, a continuous presence of that adrenaline response, so that it's no longer so helpful. We've internalized the threat itself. And someone asked me recently, but in the case of this pandemic, the threat is real. The shark really is on us, right? But the difference is it imminent? Is it current? If it is constantly playing in our minds, then we've made it become this anxiety reaction that is so much more debilitating. So let's talk about what happens in the brain when you're having this response. One of the things that's important to think about is that delicate flood of chemicals that we all have, where your serotonin, your norepinephrine, and your dopamine needs to stay in balance. And so I showed a picture here of what's considered a normal amygdala, the fear center of your brain, versus the obsessive compulsive brain, because that is just the ultimate example of having that panic response, all of the anxiety flooding all at one time. And you can see how it's just lit up with a chemical reaction there. When that's occurring, it prevents our ability to think rationally. I think we've all been in that moment where you have that flood of anxiety and you're not able to think things through or make good judgment. We all know about fight or flight or freeze response and how that really can be a life-saving reaction, right? There are times when we need that adrenaline rush. There are times where we need to freeze from the threat. And it seems like it can be really helpful. But remember, what's amazing about this is the continuous presence of the anxiety can actually weaken your immune system. So right now, when we need our immune systems to be at their strongest and at their healthiest, the ongoing anxiety that we're fighting, the stress of what we've been dealing with for months now, actually weakens our immune system and makes us more vulnerable. So there's a lot of importance in learning to manage and monitor your stress level, being aware of when it becomes an anxiety level, and to think about when it creeps into the full-blown panic attack. So the panic attack is that flood of chemicals that no longer has an advantage or a reason. It's no longer helpful. The panic has no positive purpose for us. And in the end, we're just physically and emotionally exhausted from it. So the reason we're here to talk is that it's very important to remember that we have the power to rewire our brains, and we can actually overcome this chemical reaction in a way that we can manage our anxiety, reduce the panic, and then strengthen our immune system at the same time.
All right, so one of the things when Christy and I have done this presentation in the past, we asked the question of how do you think your physical health is impacted by your mental health? And I talked about in my talk a little bit about how my mental health has affected my physical health in so many ways. I definitely feel things more because of my anxiety. I'd like you all to take a minute and really think about how your body has responded to this period of time. And one of the things we've asked in previous things, but we have a lot of attendees today, is just to write in the chat section different things that may have occurred from this list that you may be feeling during this period of time. I will tell you that at the beginning of COVID, I started to have the symptoms of what the COVID-19 had. I thought, you know, every time I had a stuffy nose, or sometimes when my throat hurt, I thought I definitely was impacted in some way by the COVID-19. And then I realized, after having several conversations, including with the clinicians that work for JFS, is that we all have this, and that our mental health absolutely impacts our physical health. So I love seeing this right now, that a lot of you are responding back. Please be aware of the fact that your body does respond to how you're thinking in your head. And we're gonna actually give you some tools and tips on how to work through this.
You'd think I'd know how to unmute myself by now. Sorry about that. Let's talk about that psychological impact of this pandemic and the COVID-19. When we have something where there's been some kind of disaster, a flood or a tornado, then we send in, sometimes literally send in the troops. We send in a response team. We send in mental health providers to help people deal with this huge trauma response that goes with the physical disaster that occurs. So right now, we're dealing with a global scale disaster, probably unlike anything that anyone's ever seen before that's living these days. And all of a sudden, we're having this huge increase in grief and anxiety. Suicidality is up. We're definitely seeing more of those things. If anyone had a trauma that occurred earlier in their life, it's very likely to be triggered by this response. So people are really experiencing this exhaustion and this increase in mental health symptoms. And that issue of anxiety has really become increased. But what's different than if it were a tornado or hurricane or flood is that there's this tendency to blame ourselves for what we are experiencing, for this emotional reaction that's happening and the physical reaction within our limbic system. So, you know, Tally referenced how feeling all of this anxiety and feeling this response, then you begin to wonder, are these COVID symptoms? Because we certainly know that there's a huge range of COVID symptoms, and everybody seems to be experiencing them a little bit differently. And I've encountered that over and over again with our clients that call in. It's very, very difficult sometimes to discern the difference between your physical exhaustion, your emotional exhaustion, the body aches, the inability to sleep, the headaches, all of those things. And then, is this my emotional response to this stress and this anxiety plus some spring allergies that have, you know, coincided? So it's very, very unique time in our history. But the piece of it that I think is really just reinforces it is that people are blaming themselves for their reactions. They had this idea that suddenly they're going to get their pantry completely cleaned out and do all these projects around the house that require this positive energy that they didn't have during normal times, but they suddenly expect themselves to be able to produce that in the middle of this pandemic. So I think one of the things that's just important to think about is managing our expectations, being aware of our responses, and thinking about what we can do to combat that and rewire our brains. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth.
Okay, I think this is one that we can all relate to on several different, absolutely something that we're all dealing with and working with right now is anxiety and social media. But I'm not just talking about anxiety and social media. I also would like to talk about how the 24/7 news cycle affects us. And I just want to let you know that a lot of people seem to get very caught up in social media and, of course, the news these days, because that's what we're seeing constantly. I actually had to do something for myself at the beginning of this time because I was watching the news on a level that probably was extremely unhealthy. I felt that if I watched the news that I would have some kind of control. And as I said, with anxiety, we all want some control during this period of time, but especially if we're dealing with anxiety and stress. And so after I saw that how much this was affecting myself with insomnia, with heart palpitations, with fear, with anxiety attacks, I knew I had to do something different. So each day I actually make sure that I listen to the news at the beginning of the day for 10 minutes a day. And then I do not return to it. I don't look at social media in the middle of the day. And I really think that everyone should think about implementing a schedule for yourself. And then if you really feel that you have to return to the news cycle or you have to return to social media, do it for a certain period of time. Another 10 minutes at the end of the day is good enough, but don't do it. Make sure that it's at least 2 hours before bed. But really think about unplugging at this point. I can't begin to tell you that our brains are not equipped to deal with this amount of trauma and this amount of stories, of this constant feeding into something that this is so negative at this point. So really be cognizant of that.
One of the most important ways that we can take control over those reactions is using mindfulness techniques. If you think about that idea of social contagion, the emotional reaction spreads just as much as the virus itself. And I've got a great example of that. If you remember the moment that you realized everybody was buying up toilet paper like it was, the end of the world, and you didn't have any, I bet there was a bit of a social contagion response there where suddenly you had an emotional response to that. So those reactions very much spread from one person to another. This mindfulness technique can be like using sanitizer for your brain. If you have exposed yourself to something that triggers an emotional response, an anxiety response, then you can use these mindfulness techniques to kind of reset your brain to a calm place. I like to reference a friend of mine who talks about that depression, we tend to focus too much on the past. And with anxiety, we tend to focus too much on the future. And we're planners, we want to think ahead. So we're focusing on the future. We're not seeing as much progress as we'd like to see these days. And we can really get swept up in that. So by using mindfulness, it brings us back very much to the present, just to feel what we're feeling in the here and now in our bodies. And so it's a very, very simple, powerful, short technique that you can use that's like sanitizer for your brain for these emotional reactions. Now, I want you to know there are thousands of resources out there for mindfulness techniques to teach you where to learn to use them and how to use them. But the things that they have in common is they all keep you kind of centered on what you're feeling in your body right now and not in your head so much. Come back to the here and now of just what's going on in the moment. Using these mindfulness techniques actually strengthens our immune system. It improves the neuroplasticity of our brain and builds new synapses in our brain. So it keeps us young. It keeps us with new neural connections. So it's super powerful, and it will make you feel so much more calm and focused. And in a minute, we're going to do a very small version of a mindfulness technique just to give you a sample of what it can do.
All right, so before we actually go into a wonderful mindfulness exercise that Christy is going to lead us in, I just want to talk to you about, this is one of my favorite slides and one that has sparked a lot of discussion. What I can control and what I can't control. And I will tell you right now, during this period of time, this is the thing that I have had the most difficult time with. And I really couldn't let myself just breathe and just be okay with sort of not being in control. So I actually started a gratitude journal. And I know that many of you are probably doing this or have done this, but it's writing 5 things at the beginning of the day that are good about this period of time. And it cannot be duplicated. So don't think that you're going to continue to write the same thing day after day, but make sure that you're actually thinking very hard about 5 things that you're grateful for. And I will tell you that sets the stage for the day that I'm going to have. So I don't feel like I have to be so much in control anymore of all these other things, because I will say at the beginning, I had such a problem with people not wearing masks that I could feel my blood pressure and I could feel my shoulders clench up. I felt my fingers, I couldn't, and I realized I needed to let that go. So I have been more cognizant and aware of my thinking and the way that I do things during this period of time. And I can tell you right now that these are lessons that I want to bring with me during our next phase after this period of time. So if you want to, I think another wonderful thing that you could be doing is write what I can control and what I can't control on 2 different lists. And be very aware that you probably can't control more than you can control, but work on the mindfulness to let that go. And Christy, please go into that.
Okay. So one of the things that I love is that there's actually a really lovely study that talks about how to reduce your anxiety up to 65% reduction of anxiety symptoms. And it's just using music. And I bet everybody on this call today has experienced deliberately choosing music that will help you to feel energized, help you to feel more studious. I always had a soundtrack to study by, that kind of thing. So this is a list of the top 10 most relaxing songs. It's available on Spotify, so you don't have to scramble to write it down right now. And also, we are going to share these slides at the end of the presentation. We'll get them out to you, so don't worry about that. But the #1 song was Weightless by Marconi Union. And what they did is they had a study in the UK where they put people in a situation where they gave them a stressful task to do, and then they had them all hooked up to machines to monitor their stress reaction and their anxiety reactions, and measured their heart rate, measured their breathing, measured their oxygen rate, all of those things. And they found a 65% reduction in the anxiety response just from playing this music that's deliberately engineered to be the right slow rhythm to kind of go with our deep breathing and the vibrations that go with our new research on polyvagal response. So it's pretty amazing to retrain our brains and to sanitize that anxiety away. There's 1,000 techniques out there. There's some apps listed here in our slideshow. You can get more on our website. And we thank you all for your time today.
Thank you, Tolly and Christy. I really appreciate you reminding us to manage our expectations and to give ourselves grace during this time period. So thank you both. Just a fascinating slide and presentation. Now I'd like to introduce our panel today. We have Jennifer Knudsen, CEO of Clarity Child Guidance Center. Clarity is a nonprofit mental health care treatment center specializing in children ages 3 to 17. Evita Marin, CEO of Rise Recovery, an organization that helps teens, young adults, and families overcome the effects of drug and alcohol, and partners with the community in education and prevention. And we have Kat Witter, who's the wellness coordinator at Alamo Heights ID. I'd like to begin today's panel conversation and ask each one of you to answer the following question. How has the isolation of staying at home impacted our youth? So I thought I'd start with Jessica.
Yeah, thank you so much, Margaret. Very happy to be here. I've spent my career in mental health, and as Tally alluded to in her presentation, this is unlike anything we've seen. So I think part of the cause for anxiety and part of the difficulty of the impact of kids is we don't truly know what the impact of the isolation is going to have. we've really identified kids that have fallen into different categories. There's some kids that have actually done pretty well in the isolation. Maybe these were kids that were bullied at school or were having some school adjustment issues, and so they've been okay during this time period. They're probably going to have a lot of difficulty once we transition back to school. So I think they're at risk for some depression and anxiety. And then there are other kids that have really been impacted and I think are at risk even for some severe disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, we've had to cancel so much in their life, graduations, proms, and these are significant events. And I think we have to give that the gravity that it deserves, because these are, for a lot of us, kind of defining events in our adolescence. And I think the repercussions from this and of the isolation, and just if you look developmentally, the peer group is the most important relationship that these kids have, especially for our adolescents. So I think we're going to be feeling the effects of this and the effects of the isolation for many, many, many months, if not years down the road.
Mm. Thank you. Evita, would you like to speak on that question as well? How's isolation? How have you seen it from your perspective?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for your wonderful comments in this process and your honesty. I'm seeing a lot of just wonderful clarity here. I would like to share, as a CEO of a drug and alcohol recovery nonprofit for youth, that isolation is an unnatural state for the young brain, and friends are brain food. Sometimes friends are more like junk food than salad, depending on the friend, but regardless, the friends sustain that young person's brain, and they need that friend to help them define who they are and grow and challenge themselves and separate from their adults in their lives, from dependence to independence. That's the young brain's job. And isolation, and more importantly, being stuck indoors with your beloved family is a major stressor to that. And it takes that job away from the brain. So it can be crazy making. It can cause stress and anxiety, and it can even cause grief. And I think that's important to note. And where drugs come into play, or alcohol, is that they can numb those feelings. And some of our young people can start to think that this is an answer to cope with this unnatural state of isolation. And that is the great behavioral health risk of this year that I think we need to be paying attention to.
Thank you. So Kat, can you share with us what you see from your perspective?
Sure. I'm going to agree with what the other panelists have said also. Human beings are social creatures. So being without regular interaction has really caused a lot of internal struggle for our kids. It's caused uncertainty, emotional ups and downs, increased mental health issues. Also, feelings of safety and security for our kids are strongly tied to structure and routine. They expect to go to school. They might not want to. It might not be their most favorite place to go, but they expect that routine to stay in place. And so after spring break, the expectation was we will be going back to school. So when that stopped, there was further uncertainty, symptoms of depression set in, increased anxiety. You know, everything that Tally shared so openly and honestly about her struggles are things that I saw with my students, those anxiety symptoms. And then the last thing I wanted to say on this question was our high-risk youth have had little to no access to the essential supports that they need. And so we're seeing things like increased domestic issues happening. You know, like Evita said, being with our beloved family, you know, for some of our kids, that is not the place that they need to be. It is not a safe place for them to be. And we're seeing increased mental health with parents as well. And drug and alcohol use has not stopped. You know, everything in our world shut down, but liquor stores didn't. I think that was pretty telling, because that's contributing to what our kids are experiencing in the home.
Wow, thank you all for those incredible answers. So second question is, how has your organization pivoted to meet the needs of children and youth during this time? I know this has been a heavy lift for you all personally, but professionally, how has it changed? Evita?
Happy to answer that question. Well, youth not only need peers, they need peers like them, and preferably peers with purpose. Rise Recovery provides a safe space for youth who are in recovery to meet other youth in recovery and engage in individual and group support, self-care activities, and just plain old fun, honestly, because what's the point of recovery if it sucks? So before COVID, we hosted recovery proms, sober fiesta parties, lock-ins, trips. We'll return to those someday. But in the meantime, we've taken our services and fun activities completely online, and it's absolutely not the same. But it does demonstrate that we haven't abandoned our kids, and we're just meeting them on a different level and doing our best to do that. And when they achieve their first milestones, like a 30-day, a 90-day, 180-day days of sobriety, we leave sobriety tokens at their doorstep. We do what we can in a way that maintains that safety. But we understand that there's a risk to behavioral health with this lack of intimate relationship.
How about you, Kat? What have you all done in the schools?
Well, if I do say so myself, I really feel like my district did an amazing job at pivoting back in the spring. We had a continuous learning plan, so we maintained the goal of educating our students through virtual means, meaning our teachers were teaching classes virtually every day in our district. Some districts were doing it a little differently, but our teachers were teaching every day. Our elementary students continued to have their morning meetings, which was a really huge highlight for those kids. They still got their classroom stuff, but those morning meetings where they just got to check in and tell their classmates what they had been doing was really essential to their social emotional well-being. In terms of social emotional support and mental health support, which is my job, I was able to provide continued support to 119 students during our 10 weeks of continuous learning. It was hard, I'm not gonna lie. It was hard to get in touch with those kids. They weren't responding to emails, but once I got a hold of their cell phone numbers, I could text and then they would respond, and we did video chats and we did texting back and forth. And additionally, one of my roles is to provide support and education to parents on difficult topics. We call it Breaking the Silence. And I had to cancel our last Breaking the Silence presentation for the year, but I pivoted by apparently creating a series called Chat with Kat. And so we had 4 different presentations that we did on this format, like we're doing here today, talking about shelter at home issues like parenting during a pandemic, elementary student needs in a pandemic, behavioral issues, and then we also did one that was just centered for teachers and kind of supporting them as well. And so I feel like we really shifted. It was hard. My brain was tired. I think all of our teachers were tired, we did it one way and then we had to completely go this way. And we were hoping it would be different, but we'll see what happens in a few weeks.
How about you, Jessica?
So, at Clarity, we tried to take a multifaceted approach because we do pride ourselves on being here for the continuum of care for mental health, from prevention to crisis services. So the main thing is our crisis services department never closed. We did figure out a way to get kids in a congregate care setting and do it safely. So we've been able to contain any spread and still be here to treat the kids that are maybe actively suicidal and homicidal. So if you have a child in your life that you're concerned about their safety, we're here, and you can just walk in 24/7 to our crisis services service. We've also been able to keep our partial hospital program open for our step downs from inpatients. So that's been used a lot because a lot of these kids are really suffering from a high level of anxiety. And then we really pivoted in terms of our outreach and our education. We found out pretty early in March and April there wasn't a lot of information online about how to manage the stress and anxiety related to COVID. So we did a couple of things on our outreach website, which is 1 in 5 Minds, and we developed a couple of specific tools. One for educators. It's a educator-specific page that's got not only COVID-specific resources for how to deal with anxiety and telelearning and all of those things that educators are challenged with right now, but how to take care of yourself in this time. There's also parent resources on how to deal with your own anxiety and the stress that your kids might be under. And then the last pivot we did is for the first probably 90 days of the pandemic, all of our outpatient services were done via telehealth. So we were able to get all of our clinicians set up and work with our families. Kat kind of alluded to the digital divide issue. It wasn't an answer for everybody because we do have some families that weren't able to access that. But especially in the early days, it was a lifesaver. Now we have transitioned to some in-person services. Again, we're at about 25% capacity because our really little guys don't do well with telehealth, and some of our folks with sensory issues don't do well over the computer. So we have been able to open it up with social distancing and be able to do therapy and psychiatric services in person for some of those kids.
Y'all are amazing how you've done so well to pivot during this time. I know it's such a challenge. So what would you suggest we can be doing now to prepare children for the changes in the school year ahead? And we'll start with Kat.
I'm going to keep my answer kind of simple. So because this is such a complex and difficult situation. So regardless of how our kids are receiving their education, whether it's at home or in person, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. Structure and routine are essential. It's what makes our kids feel safe and secure. It is going to be different. The structure and the routine are going to be different for those kids going back to in-person. They're going to be thinking in their minds that it's going to be how it was before. But very quickly, if we keep to our routine, kids are so much more resilient than we can imagine, and they get with that new structure and routine. But it's also important, if you're doing the at home, that you find that structure and routine there as well. Mm-hmm. Additionally, and this goes along with what we've been talking about in terms of anxiety symptoms and depression symptoms. We as adults have the ability to instill confidence and comfort to kids at this time. They're taking their cues from us on how to handle this situation. So don't mistake what I'm saying. No one is going to come out of this pandemic unscathed. I mean, this is complicated and negative for all of us, but how we as adults manage our own emotions during this time really allows our kids to feel safe. So what we need to do is focus on ourselves as much as we need to focus on our kids, if not more.
Oh, that's great. What do you think, Jessica?
Well, I couldn't agree with what Kat said more. It's that old analogy of the airplane that, if the airbags come down, you put it on yourself first so you can then take care of your loved one or your child. If we're not, as adults and parents and caregivers and educators, managing our own stress and anxiety, we have no ability to assist our kids. And so we really have a responsibility to role model it. And it's, one thing we're never taught as adults, not let alone parents, is how to role model that it's okay to not be okay. How do you say to a kid, it's okay to have a lousy day? That's all right. And we're going to have them during this. And, showing grace to yourself that you're going to have the day where something falls off the plate. You're going to have the day where the classroom doesn't log on because you're having Wi-Fi issues. You're going to have the day where your conference call gets interrupted because you get booted off the computer because of your kid's school. And that's okay. I think, I'm speaking as a wife and a mother now. We're so hard on ourselves that everything falls on our shoulders and everything has to be perfect. It's not going to be during this time. And I think we've got to role model that for our kids, that it's okay to not be okay, and show them how to do that with grace, and that we pick it back up the next day and try to continue through this journey.
Evita?
Coming from the recovery frame, I think we can understand that addiction and substance misuse is a real possibility for a lot of kids who never engaged in that before, coming from all kinds of places, personalities, all kinds of people. And they may still be struggling to manage and cope in ways that made sense for them in isolation, and may even have been permitted by their guardians, but those ways are no longer going to make sense in a classroom or in this recovering world, the rest of the world. So I would say let's not expect kids who think they need these dysfunctional behaviors like drugs or alcohol to give it up without replacing it with different, healthier coping skills. And that's where we can come in and help. School is a perfect place to help redirect some of that wayward behavior into exercise, sports, words of encouragement, an ear to listen to them, writing, singing, so many electives. And I'm hopeful now that we're recognizing the behavioral aspect of the impact of COVID, that for a future school system that doesn't define drug-dependent kids as less capable, but as possibly having a substance use disorder, just like a mental health, any other mental health disorder. And I would also say that just say no, not N-O, but K-N-O-W is a phrase that I love to share. Help kids know themselves, help them understand what they're curious about before they get into it. Know how to talk to your children about drugs or alcohol, because if you just say no, they're still curious, what are they going to do? And they'll figure it out, and they'll figure it out with their peers and not with you. And so I brought today a book that I would recommend to start that conversation. I highly recommend this. It's High by David Nick Sheff. It's a counterintuitive approach to what we're used to hearing. Just say no. But it's about addressing drug and alcohol curiosity head on, because their brains are wired to be curious about things. And the more they know the impacts of what they're curious about, the more likely they'll make healthier choices. So that's what I would suggest.
Excellent. Thank you all. You are giving so many great tips, and I really appreciate your insight. I wanted to share with you a quote about the Stockdale paradox, and it's named after Admiral Jim Stockdale, who spent 8 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He was tortured more than 20 times during his imprisonment from 1965 to 1973. He worked every day to help the other prisoners survive the physical and emotional treatment. When interviewed, he was asked who didn't make it out. And he said, "Oh, that's easy, the optimist. They believed they would be out by Christmas. And when Christmas came, they believed they would be out by Easter. They died of a broken heart." He said, "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they may be." So my final question for you all today is, what has been your greatest challenge for either you personally or professionally during this time? Who wants to go first? Kat.
I will. So personally, is not where my biggest challenge was. I continued with some of my routines. I embraced doing Zumba in my living room with my entire family sitting on the couch watching me, and that is a true story. Not exactly how I wanted to be doing that, but we enjoy being at home, and we really kind of got into a routine pretty quickly personally. My biggest struggle was feeling confident in my job. So I'm going to be brutally honest. We all have expectations for ourselves personally and professionally, and those expectations are typically centered on the fact that we have reliable and set resources and criteria. COVID completely took away my familiar resources. So I had to work at finding new ones, a new way to measure my own success. So if I thought I was being successful, for instance, at the high school, it was because it was rare for me to have a moment without a student needing some kind of support. The door was open, they were always there. I knew I was being successful because I was very busy. And then here I was sitting in my home office waiting for somebody to call, or waiting for them to be on the video chat with me and they forgot. I was desperately trying to reach out to kids that I knew needed support. And so I had to work really hard at creating new criteria for myself based on the resources that I had available now that were very different, if that makes sense. And I feel like I did. And so it might actually be kind of a shift now to go back to work and be like, oh, I have these different resources again, and now I have to pivot again and create some new criteria to measure my own success.
Yeah, I can identify with that one. What about you, Jessica?
So I have two, if that's okay to share. On the work front, you know, we never closed our congregate care setting. So it was tremendously challenging with all the different information that was coming in from March forward. You know, how do you keep everybody safe, and how do you keep staff safe? And I know that's probably what's heavy on the mind of a lot of the educators right now, is if you're asked to go back in the classroom, how can you do it safely? And I'm knocking on wood, we have not had community spread here, even though we do have 22 kids in close quarters together. So, you know, that tells me if you do it smartly, if you stay on top of things, if everybody's masking, practicing social distancing, and washing their hands, there is a way to do it safely. But that was tremendously stressful at the beginning because we just didn't know. There's still a lot we don't know, but we just weren't sure about the spread. So I don't know if that helps to ease anybody's mind, and I'm happy to kind of share more details of what we did if there are educators that have specific questions. On a personal front, and it touches on what I talked about managing our own anxiety. So I'm considered an essential employee because it's a hospital. So I did not have the option of working from home. My husband works in telecommunications, also didn't have the option of working from home. So our kids have been in childcare this entire time without a break from March 13th till today. We got the email from childcare that explained their change in procedure, that we were just gonna drive up, they were gonna come get them out of the vehicle, take their temperature. So I've got 3-year-old twins. So I prepped them before that, you know, it's going to be different. I can't go into the building with you, you know, did my best to get them ready. Nothing prepared me for what that experience was like, because you have a swarm of people in masks and face shields and gloves with thermometers coming in, opening the car doors, and what felt to me, you know, whisking my children out of the vehicle. But tried my best to be, you know, upbeat when the kids were in the car, and oh wow, they've got masks on, and isn't that interesting? As soon as they left, tears the entire way to school. And we probably did that for the first week. I don't think I made it the first week without crying on the way to work during drop off, but I knew I had to hold it together when I was in front of them, because otherwise we weren't going to get through that. And now it's very normal, and not, I mean, for better or for worse, it's very normalized. They have their masks, they know it's part of the routine. But that was tremendously challenging at the beginning to try to put up that brave front for them so we could get through it.
Thank you for sharing, Jessica. What about you, Avita?
Yeah, I think personally, I really relate to what you're sharing, Jessica. And I think it's from the perspective, I have a 6-year-old about to start first grade. I have a 3-year-old with an autoimmune disease. So I've got, you know, my frame of how I'm looking at this world, and the things that I'm trying to do to keep this world as normal for them as possible. And I, at the same time, need to recognize that the tantrums that come from, you know, we had an experience where our 6-year-old had this enormous tantrum, and I could have placated it, and instead I sat with it to I just had this feeling I needed to hear what was going on. It was fairly recent, after months of this new world, and understanding that she just needed, like all of us do, I think, from time to time, to be acknowledged that this is hard, that she recognized that we're doing our best to kind of make her world something good, but that it's just not the same. And that the depression, the outbursts, anxiety, tantrums, substance use, whatever it looks like for the people we love, it's not always that they're ungrateful for the world in front of them. They just may be grieving the loss of a life that they knew before, and that's perfectly okay. And so if we can find space as caretaking adults to recognize that, that can be an important part of the healing process for all of us. And so that's where I'm at. That I think professionally, the challenge is in line with that, is understanding that there is a fatality risk in neglecting the body, but also in neglecting the mind and what's going on there, and trying to weigh the risks. And so that's the constant battle for me, is making sure we're not just listening to the hearts and lungs of our sick people, but that we're also paying attention to the feelings and behaviors of the people that we know are behaviorally struggling. And so, you know, I hope that we can all be there for each other and pause and listen to one another so that we can get through this together.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here today. And I can't tell you how much it means to me. And I know everyone who's on this call today, that you were so honest and forthcoming with sharing your own personal stories, because we are all, someone described it to me, it's like collective grief. And it's something that none of us have experienced before. And I loved hearing from each one of your perspectives. So thank you for all the work you do for our community, especially the children and the youth. And I wish everybody could hear this, because I think it's just such great practical information, and continue to give one another grace as we move forward. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to move on to Sarah Mann. And Sarah is a career public school educator currently working as a school trauma specialist for UTSA, supporting schools in our area and other areas of Texas. She meets student and staff needs during loss of life events. Sarah will give us some practical tools and techniques for the classroom as we continue to navigate the new reality of living in a COVID-19 world. So Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Margaret. Am I actually unmuted? I think I am. Thanks, Margaret. I'm really excited that you invited me to participate in this symposium and have an opportunity to speak to so many educators across our area. It's been really powerful so far. So thank you to all the panelists before us. They've given us lots of great things to talk about and to think about. So I'm excited about that. I was also super excited to see so many participants in there that I know, people that I've worked with for years. So it's excited to see those of you that I know on the participant list. And for those of you that don't know me, here's just a little bit about me as we move into my portion of the presentation. I am the mom of two really amazing young ladies. Both of them are Aggies and going to Texas A&M. And if all goes as planned, they are both going to graduate this year, one in 5 years and one in 3 years come May. So we're super excited about the raise that we're going to get in June, when we don't have to send all that rent and tuition money to College Station. But they're amazing young ladies, and we're super proud of them. I'm also married to a really remarkable man who's a fellow educator. We met in our first education class in college, Dr. Hermanson's Foundations of Education. He likes for everybody to know that I sat in the back with the jocks and he sat in the front with the nerds. But it was apparently a match made in heaven. We're going to celebrate our 26th anniversary in just a few days. My career in education has spanned 2 states in 5 different districts. I have worked at every campus level across the K-12 continuum. I've been a teacher, a counselor, an assistant principal, a campus principal. I've held multiple offices at multiple roles at central office. But my current job is for UTSA as a school trauma specialist. And that position was born after the Sutherland Springs church shooting. And the campus university received some funds from the governor's office to provide some mental health supports and behavioral supports following that incident. And so that grant that UTSA, the counseling department at UTSA holds, really funds 2 different avenues. It funds my role, which allows me to work with school districts, helping them plan and be prepared to respond to crisis, specifically loss of life, and then to be there to coach and mentor and support them through those times that happen. And the other part of that grant funds Paloma Place, which is a group of my colleagues that work at a facility in Floresville, where we have partnered with the Children's Bereavement Center to provide counseling services at no cost for children and families in the area. So I have a great deal of experience in all areas, but I'm back in my mental health realm, bringing my administrator experience back to my school counselor connections. Today, with the time that we have, I'm going to back up and go back over just a few of those physiological impacts that Tally and Christy talked about at the beginning. I want to highlight some of those. I think those will be really helpful for you as we move forward to understand what's really happening inside your bodies. And then hopefully you'll walk away with some strategies that both you and your students can use as you work to get started back into the new school year. I love, Talia and Christy already talked about this, but my favorite example of what happens in our brain and in our body when we experience those threats and those fears that they mentioned earlier comes from the hand model that Dr. Siegel has come up with. And I usually show it when I do trainings about the physiological impacts of stress on our bodies. But I encourage you, not now because we don't want you to leave the symposium, but after the symposium, take a few minutes and go to YouTube and just search for the 3 main parts of the brain by Dr. Russ Harris. That's my favorite explanation. A colleague that I work with now at Paloma Place, Marilyn Grubbs, shared that with me. And he really does a great job of helping us have a visual representation of we have this core inner part of our brain that's really connected to emotions, which is also connected to the instinctual part of our brain, that fight or flight part of the brain that the ladies have already mentioned. But the other part of our brain is what you're really worried about because you're educators, and that's the thinking part of our brain. This part of our brain is where learning really happens, and it's where our memories are stored, and it's where we process information and where we build connections and we practice our reasoning skills. We have our speech centers and all of the facts and details that we need to recall. Those are all stored in this thinking part of the brain, separate and apart from this emotional center of the brain. And so when we're under stress, it's this part of our brain that's working more actively, and we have less access to this part of our brain. So what that means is that when we experience trauma or stress or anxiety or a pandemic like we're all living through right now, we begin to feel those effects in our brain and in our body. And we sometimes think of trauma as, I think one of our downfalls just across society is that we think of trauma as events. And trauma isn't always just about an event. Trauma is really about the physiological thing that happens inside us when we feel hopeless or we feel helpless or we feel fearful. And sometimes that's connected to events. That's connected to an accident or an act of violence or a tornado or a flood or a hurricane. Sometimes it is connected to events, but sometimes it's just about the things that are happening around us. Maybe not necessarily to us, but the things that are happening around us that leave us with those feelings of helplessness or hopelessness or fearfulness. And it creates the same type of physiological response inside our body. The other thing that I think that's really important for us to realize right now, especially because we're in this pandemic, is that for me to have that response inside my body, I don't really truly have to be in danger. But if I perceive myself to be in danger, then it creates that same physiological response. Trauma can be real or perceived and still make the same things happen in your brain or in your body. The pandemic that we're experiencing worldwide is a great example of this. Everybody's experience with it has been different. Some of you may have direct connections to the illness itself. Some of you may have been sick yourselves or have family members that were sick. Some of you may have lost family members to COVID-19. Everybody's experience may be different. Some of you may not even know anybody that has it. Some of you may not have a personal experience, but know many others that have. So while everyone's experience is different, everyone does have some common experiences that they share through this pandemic. We've all had disruptions to our schedules. We've all had disruptions to our routines. We've all had disruptions to the way we interact with others. And so everyone has experienced it to some extent. So that means everybody has probably had, to some extent, that physiological response happening inside our bodies. The intensity of it for individuals and the duration of it does matter. And so you'll notice that some people may be responding very differently than you, or you may be responding very differently than others. But that is about the way your brain and your body are interpreting the situation, and that it's processing that information. Sally, Chris, you mentioned this earlier, and there are all kinds of things that happen inside our bodies when we're subject to that toxic stress. That's what we call it when we experience something that causes that physiological response to happen in our body, and it goes on for a long time. It's not uncommon at all for us to experience those symptoms for 4 to 6 weeks after an event. For our fellow citizens in the state of Texas that lived through Hurricane Harvey most recently, and the devastation that was associated with that, it would not have been uncommon for those people to be experiencing the physical symptoms or the emotional symptoms or the behavioral symptoms connected to that toxic stress for 4 to 6 weeks. But that was an event that once the hurricane came through and the flooding was over and the damaging storms had passed, it was over. But right now we're living in a different kind of event, not like anything anybody has any framework for or frame of reference or experience for. We're still in the middle of it, and we've been in it for 4.5 months, and we don't have an end in the foreseeable future. So the fact that we're experiencing these things and may continue to experience these things for an extended period of time is why it's even more important for us to be mindful of it. All of these different types of symptoms could be prevalent in you and your kids when they come back. You may even see behavioral or cognitive symptoms. You may see, and this has already been talked about, with the drug and the alcohol prevalence that's continuing to persist, some self-destructive behaviors or avoidance or concentration problems, not able to concentrate and remember things, trouble making decisions. All of those are very common symptoms that the ladies have already talked about today. So when you're experiencing those, I want you to be mindful of the fact that this is a result of the toxic stress that's built up in your body. And it's why the mindfulness practices, the grounding practices that the ladies talked about earlier today are so important. When it comes to school, though, what we know, and you already know this from your teacher preparation, is that stressed brains can't learn. And that means you, and it means your kids. So our first priority is to recognize that the stress and the anxiety is there and do what we can to mitigate that. Because we know learning has to happen, but we also know that learning can't happen when it's this part of our brain that's active and not this part of our brain that is really in control of what's happening. I know you've all seen this graphic before. We used to float it around in May. We used to see it on Facebook in May. And I know as a campus principal, I put it in my staff bulletins at the end of the school year. And we used to think it was funny, but the reality of it is for educators, for us educators, that's just not funny anymore. We are not looking at that picture and laughing. And the reason we're not laughing now is because here we are on the cusp of a new school year. For some of you, I think your days started yesterday. Some of them are going to start next week, and some of you start the week after that. But here you are on the cusp of a new school year thinking, I have 187 contract days to get through, and I look like the owl on the right. How in the world am I ever going to manage getting through 187 days? And the reason you feel like that is because this chronic stress that you've been living with, this toxic stress that you've been living with, started in March. And you didn't realize it was stress at the beginning because the first thing you got is that notice that said, hey, don't come back for a few more days. We're extending spring break, right? And your first thought was, yes, this is awesome. And so we were so excited. For some of you, you got an extra day or two. Some of you got an extra week of that break time, depending on how your school responded. But then the anxiety set in because as educators, we know what happens after spring break. We even have a name for it, right? We call it testing season. And then the anxiety started because all of a sudden you're panicking because you had a daily schedule. You had broken it down from the day after spring break until the day of your student STAR test or EOC or AP exam. And now you're panicking because there's no way you can cover that content. You can't lose any more days because you're not going to have time to cover that content and your kids are never going to be prepared for the test. And then after that stress and anxiety came the worry. Because then you started to think about your kids that you knew were in environments that it probably wasn't very good for them to have an extended spring break. They were not in homes where they felt safe or secure or where they had supervision that they needed. For many of them, food insecurity was heightened. And so then the worry sets in. And then came well, we're not coming back, but we're going to do distance learning. And you're worried because you can't even remember to submit your attendance on time. And they're calling you from the office 3 times a week to say, hey, you still haven't submitted your attendance online. And now you have to teach online all day, every day with kids. And how are you ever going to manage that? But teachers are resilient and you mustered through and you valiantly triumphed to the end of the year. And you should have had a recovery time like you normally do over summer. But with summer came other, maybe even more personal disruptions where you had more family members that were sick, or you had to cancel vacations, and the continued worry about what's going to happen. What is it going to look like when we go back? So you never had that recovery time to get away from looking like the owl on the right. So my hope for today is to really highlight educators' resiliency. The reason you finished the year the way you did is because educators are resilient, and it's what we do. It's part of the nature and culture of our profession. And that will happen again this fall. We know for a fact that our kids need us, and we're going to rise to that occasion. But to do that, what I really want to do with our remaining time today is focus on two things. I want to give you some ideas to help you not look like that hot mess of an owl that was on the right. In order for you to be able to feel confident and move forward into the start of the new year, we've got to help you get your feathers straightened out. We've got to reduce some of that toxic stress and help manage some of that anxiety. And then we also have to do the same thing for our kiddos, because they're a hot mess too, y'all. The ladies have already mentioned this. Tally and Christy talked about it. And then Kat and Jessica and Avita mentioned some of these same things during the panel discussion today. Our kids are coming with a lot of toxic stress in their bodies too. And so we've got to figure out how to get them back in that school starting mode, and they've got their new backpack and they're ready to go. We've got to figure out how to get them back to that place too. So I'm going to start first by talking about you. This is really just about you as educators, as counselors and social workers and teachers and administrators. This is really about you. And there's three things that I want you to think about as you move forward into the school year. I want you to think about practicing community care, giving grace, and prioritizing the social emotional well-being of each other as adults. So to start with, let's talk about community care. The ladies have already given us tons of great ideas and strategies and reasons for why we need to practice self-care. Individually, that is super important. And I love that we brought up the airplane example. You have to put your oxygen mask on first. So self-care is important, and I don't want to negate that. But schools are different. Schools function differently than other entities, other organizations. And schools, more than other entities, have this really tight community that they develop. And so community care is recognizing the need to focus on the collective and really taking care of people physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually as a group. So thinking about that collectiveness. The way that you work together as a community, and I mean as a school community, as a campus and as a district, to thrive will be more important this year than it ever has before. And you already do this, okay? Because we all know that our campus is the best, right? Everybody believes that their campus is the best, and you can do things better than the other campuses in your district, and you know it at heart. And you proudly show it, because when we used to get to have convocations with hundreds or thousands of us together, you all wore your t-shirts that looked alike, and you all sat together because you were the best, right? That's that type of collective unity that schools hold is really important. And it's really in jeopardy right now because we are split. We have some face-to-face pieces. We have some virtual learning pieces. So all of our kiddos aren't going to be there. Our staff is going to be doing different assignments. And the way we deliver things and connect to people looks very different. So that collectiveness is at risk, but it's a critical part of making schools what they are. So it's really important that you also, in addition to practicing self-care, really think about community care. And the way you do that is by focusing on your colleagues. And when you have a colleague that's struggling, remember that they're probably functioning in this part of their brain right now, and they're not who they normally are because they don't have access to reasoning and good decision making and the things that they normally do. And you need to figure out how you can help them. So figure out how you can help your colleagues when they're struggling. It's also going to be super important for you as educators to keep your circle. You know who your circle is. It's those people that you used to sit around the lunch table with. It's those people that you used to go to happy hour with. Whoever your circle is. First of all, make sure everybody is included in a circle, but then you have to find ways to keep that circle intact. that circle is a critical part of self-care and community care when it comes to schools. So it's going to look different because you can't just pull 12 chairs around the table in the break room for lunch. You're not going to have the same type of opportunities to interact with your circle the way you used to. So you've got to be creative and find ways to stay together, to keep that circle together, and find ways for that team to interact in the same types of ways. So you're sharing the same type of stories, you're sharing your personal stories, you're showing pictures of kids, you're doing the things that you typically do with that circle, but it just may look different. It's not going to happen the way it's happened in years past. And for my administrators that are out there, I want you to think about how your staff, your teams, educators live by schedules. We are used to very detailed calendars that are printed out and given to us months, if not years in advance. Our day is run down to the minute by bells. We have structure and we have order, and that's how we live our lives. And now all of a sudden, all of that seems upended. So educators are feeling a really deep-rooted sense of loss of control, because they used to know exactly what the beginning of the school year looked like, and now we don't have a clue. So that we understand the challenges that administrators face. We know that you're being handed unbelievably difficult tasks and challenges to solve. And we also know that those are changing rapidly, that you're putting out information to your staff, and then within the day, if not the hour, you're getting different guidance, and that has to change. So we understand that, but to help your teams feel better, to make them feel like they are not completely losing control, anytime you can create opportunities for them to have voice, that's going to be super important. So when you can survey them about things, or offer Q&A for them about things, or if there's certain things that you can delegate to committees, to let a committee have some say in how things happen. We understand there's going to be a lot that you can't. There's a lot of safety protocols and new procedures that are coming down that there's not going to be that opportunity. But where you can create, that's going to be important for your staff to regain some of that sense of control. And most importantly, a big part of community care is understanding that everybody's experience is different, which means everybody's response is going to be different. And so we've got to be mindful of that. The other thing that's going to be really important as you move into the school year with your colleagues is to really think about how are you going to give grace, and how many times can you give grace? You as educators and administrators and counselors and social workers, just like the kids, you can't learn when you're stressed. You don't make decisions well. You don't process information well. You're going to struggle to remember things. And we struggle to show empathy. So you need a whole bunch of Elle Woods at all your campuses. If y'all remember from Legally Blonde, Elle Woods, and the way they celebrated with their snaps, you need to be intentional about creating opportunities to celebrate. And you need to celebrate everything that you can, because it helps remove us from this part of the brain and lets us get back to this part of the brain. It takes us from the instinctual part of the brain to the emotional part of the brain, and then back to our thinking part of our brain. So celebrate all kinds of things that wouldn't necessarily be things that you would celebrate. That cute coffee cup makes me smile every time you drink out of it when we're on Zoom. Thank you for bringing that cup to our meeting every day. Thank you for getting your stuff in on time, because that made it so that I could do what I needed to. And that, I know that may have been difficult for you to meet that deadline, but it made a big difference for me. Celebrate creative problem solving. You're being faced with challenges like you've never seen before. So celebrate the fact that, okay, we threw everything out and we completely started over. Celebrate that and think about how you will work to do those things. And as already mentioned by Jessica, celebrate vulnerability. It's okay to be vulnerable, and let people know that you're having a bad day. And then last, as adults, I want you to think about prioritizing your social emotional well-being. You've got to take time as a staff and collectively as different teams on your campuses to check in with each other, to do mindfulness practices. Really make sure that you are building time in to check on each other. And administrators, where you can be flexible and give them choice, be flexible and give them choice. We know there's going to be a lot of places that you can't, but they need those opportunities as educators to have some sense of control. So give those to them when you can. When it comes to your kiddos, I want you to think about these things. Again, they're going to struggle to learn. So become as trauma informed and as resilience focused as you can be. I love Star Commonwealth. It's star.org, and I think Taylor will put that in the chat for you. They have unbelievable resources for educators and administrators and counselors, and they're school-based, they're school-focused. So it's all about schools. Remember that your kids aren't in this part of the brain. They're going to need a ton of reminders. This has already been mentioned some, but your kids, all of them now, it used to be your kids had experienced trauma, but all of them are coming in with some level of this. You're going to see developmental deficits. You're going to see attachment behaviors. Some kids that are super clingy, some kids that are super standoffish. You're going to see kids struggling to learn that didn't struggle before. And you're going to see, it's likely that you're going to see a lot of emotional dysregulation. You're going to see behaviors that you don't think are age appropriate. You're going to see behaviors that you didn't see before. And you need to remember that those are coming from that toxic stress. The same things that are happening inside your body are happening in their bodies. And our kids that were at risk before are even at greater risk. So we have to be in tune with those kids and checking on those kids. And one of the best ways for you to do that is to really be curious. Ask in-depth questions every opportunity you get with your kiddos. So how are you feeling about school? Who's taking care of you at home? What's the hardest part about not being at school for your virtual learners? And maybe what's the best part about not being at school for your virtual learners? And the same thing for your kids that are face-to-face, but in a socially distanced setting. So what's the hardest part about being in our classroom with it looking so much different than last year? Or what's the best part about being in our classroom and having your own space or not having to share supplies or whatever it is? Be inquisitive and curious to stay connected to their needs. So with your kiddos, I also have 3 things to think about with your kiddos. Build connections, again, really prioritize social emotional well-being and promote safety. Kat mentioned this and I'm going to circle back to that. You already know how to build connections with kids. It's what you do. And you plan specific activities at the start of every year to do that. Those still have to happen. And it's more important than ever that they happen, whether you are doing them one-on-one with kids or you're doing them in groups. Think about all those activities that you do to build connections and then find a way to make them happen in your socially distanced setting or in your virtual setting, because they are more important than ever. And it's also really important that from the top of our educational institutions to the bottom, that we acknowledge and recognize that building connections right now in the beginning is unbelievably important, more important than ever. There's no negating the academic slide. There's no negating that our kids slid some in the spring. We know that they did. There's no debating that we have a really steep climb ahead of us, but none of that academic ground is going to be made up if we don't have strong connections with our kids. So make sure that you take the time at the beginning of the year, as much time as you need when your year starts, to really connect to your kids. And make sure that those connections at the beginning and moving forward really continue to prioritize their social emotional needs. Normalize the experiences for them. Help them understand that they're not the only ones that are feeling that way. We are all going through this together. You are, and their peers are. So you might say to them, I know it's stressful. Sometimes I get really stressed out and confused about how to do this too. They need that normalization for them as they're moving into these unfamiliar learning environments. And I would encourage you to make sure that every single day in your lesson plans, and maybe multiple times a day in your lesson plans, whether it's face-to-face or virtual, that you build in opportunities for emotional awareness checks and emotional regulation activities. So even if it's just a simple, okay, everybody, show me 1 to 5, best day ever, worst day ever, or it should be best day ever 5, worst day ever 1. Put up how many fingers? Well, how come you're at a 2? How come you're at a 4? Let them show emojis for how they're feeling that day. Build in opportunities for those kids to check, for you to check on those kids' emotions and for them to have an opportunity to voice that. That's going to be super important. And then take an opportunity to practice some breathing exercises, some grounding exercises. Christy mentioned it earlier. There's thousands of them out there if you just Google them, and find what works for you. The best part about building those into your lesson plans is when you're not taking the time you need for self-care, guess what? You're taking care of yourself when you're doing those for your kids, because you're going to give your own self-check. You're going to put up your own emoji. You're going to lead the model and model the breathing exercises or the grounding exercises, and you're getting the benefit from that too. So that's going to be super important. And then lastly, Kat mentioned this, safety is super important to our kiddos. And you do that by creating predictability and flexibility. So just like if you were starting the school year, you would post your schedules and you would talk about them and you would teach them and you would post your structures and you would practice your routine. Harry Wong's 100 first days of the 100 first day of school, you practice routines, right? That should be happening in your socially distanced face-to-face room and your virtual room. And because we're struggling emotionally right now, everybody's experiencing toxic stress, you've got to build in some laughter time. You've got to build in some brain breaks from your academic piece. You've got to build in some movement, tell some jokes. You've got to build those pieces in. You've got to build in flexibility for your kiddos, so where you can give them choice and flexibility, do that. And then remember that whatever you communicate about your expectations, you're going to have to repeat it over and over and over and over again to your kids and their parents, because everybody is experiencing that toxic stress. So you can also promote safety by minimizing their logins. Hopefully you have a learning management system where they don't have to remember 12 logins and passwords if they're virtual. Regardless of your method of delivery, virtual or face-to-face, you've got to chunk your lessons into smaller segments. When kids are here, their concentration and their memory and their fact recall time span is shorter and shorter and shorter. So you've got to chunk your lessons into much smaller pieces than you thought you needed to, virtually and face-to-face. Give more clarification and more examples than you typically would, because they're going to need that to help build those connections. And then especially for your virtual learners, if you're doing synchronous virtual instruction, then you've got to provide some office hour times for them to come back for extra clarification. That's going to be super important. Here's what we know is that when we know what to expect, we feel less stressed. And when your stress levels are lower, we feel better and we engage better and we learn better.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate you all being here today. And I'd like to recognize Dalia Contreras with City Education Partners for her support of this symposium, and for Doceli Antigiorgio with Stitch Ministries. Both were scheduled to be a part of this symposium today, but were unable to join us due to personal family losses. For more information, please visit the websites that we have listed on the screen. Everyone who participated, our panelists, you all were awesome. It gives me so much hope that people like you are working in our community and have such a vested interest in not only the youth, but the parents of these kids, our future really of our community. And so I want to thank you for taking the time to participate, and thank you for all of you who joined us today.